Kindly note that the views and opinions shared in this video are those of the speaker and do not constitute advice given by Classic Private Wealth. Any advice given by Classic Private Wealth will be in writing in the form of a wealth management proposal. Classic Private Wealth is an authorized financial services provider.
I decided that I want to talk this morning about South Africa because it's something that a lot of my clients are wondering about, and I actually thought that there were some new developments that that gives us a little bit of clarity about where we may be going. So I wanted to share that. Just before we start again, the normal thing, this is not advice. Advice is something that is always personalized because your personal situation is always more important than what is happening out there. So please don't take any of what we say as advice today. My challenge always with politics is actually very similar to the challenge in economics. And that is to not get involved in saying what should be happening and what should be done by various people, but to look at what they are doing and what they may do and actually deal with that reality rather than with some thought that you think how things might be better. So a lot of economists, for instance, would talk about monetary policy, and then they would assume that the Reserve Bank is going to do what they think is best. But that's not really a good assumption. What you have to say is, how are they making the decision? What are their likely decisions? And what are the likely consequences of those decisions? So in standing back from politics, the thing that strikes me is there are two strong forces in politics. The first strong force in politics is aspiration. So politicians who are successful will look at the aspiration of their constituents or the voters that they are trying to woo, and that aspiration will get them elected or not. That's the one half of it. The other half of it is actually vested interests. So a lot of politics is all about protecting vested interests. So what you've got to think about in politics is always the balance between aspiration and vested interests. And what often happens is that when you get a new force coming to power, it's all about aspirations being dominant. And then when that same force has been in power for a while, vested interests become extremely important. So part of what I'm going to do today is just have a bit of a look at the aspirations and the vested interests that we see around us in politics. Now, obviously, if you're talking about politics in South Africa, the first person that you have to look at is our president. And there you can see our president looking into the future with great excitement. The thing that we have to say about the president is that when he was elected president, the parliament broke into song unanimously, even from the opposition benches, and sang his praises, literally. But today, a lot of that enthusiasm has dissipated. And partly the dissipation of that enthusiasm is because of the fact that opposition has to be opposition. So you can't actually just agree with the president and be in opposition, then you won't be re-elected. So if you are opposition, you've got to be critical of the president. So that's part of it. But part of it is also that there is a great deal of disillusionment in South Africa with what Mr. Ramaphosa has actually achieved in the 2.5 years that he has been president. So effectively, he's a quarter of the way through his 10-year quota. If we take 10 years as the maximum that a president can serve, he has served 2.5 years, and what does he have to show for it? So just quickly again, back to the basic analysis of where Cyril stands, and part of what happens with any politician is you have to speculate about what part of his actions are compromises and what part of his actions is where he actually wants the country to go. And so a couple of things about Cyril. The first thing is to say that I think we should never forget that it is that people like being in power. So Cyril has had the aspiration to be president since the early 90s. He has eventually been able to realize that ambition. And I think that we have to recognize that he will not easily or gladly give up the presidency for some illusory gain of moral authority or something like that. So effectively, it's very likely that Cyril, first of all, wants to stay the president for the next 7.5 years, and that after that we can discuss the rest. So the thing, just going back in history, he was really well positioned initially to succeed Nelson Mandela as president, but by offending Winnie Mandela and Peter Mokaba, he got them to vote against him for Thabo Mbeki. Thabo Mbeki had to basically disown both of them at a later stage, but in essence, Thabo Mbeki had then become Mandela's successor. So Cyril, in essence, learned the lesson not to push too quickly for what you want, but to stay patient, and he has stayed patient through deputy presidency to Jacob Zuma. That must have been incredibly frustrating for him, but he managed to sit it out and to become the president. Now he is the president, and he's now once again required to exercise patience because he doesn't have full control of his party. But what is his own motivation? His own motivation, everything we know, is that he is personally seriously offended by corruption. So he has a strong anti-corruption drive. It's also the other thing we know about him is he is very much a consensus seeker. So he wants to get all parties to agree and to govern in a way that is acceptable to all South Africans. That means he may very often not take the radical road, but make some kind of compromise to make sure that he accommodates those around him, but also he accommodates opposition parties. So his attitude towards opposition is not that they are mere opposition. He wants to co-opt everybody and to basically govern in terms of sufficient consensus, which is a unique South African term, which is not actually even pure in language, but it does mean that you never offend anybody to the extent where they feel they can't be part of the future that you are seeing. And then the other thing that we know about Cyril is he's Catholic, and he comes to politics from, first of all, an involvement from an ethical point of view, and then through the unions, but through the unions, firstly through the black empowerment portion of the unions, and then through the COSATU Communist Party lens. So the extent to which he's a committed free marketer and he's committed to multiracialism can be in doubt. But the idea that he is in favor of clean administration and involving everybody in the country in the future and trying to actually get a growing prosperity in the country, those are things that we can take for granted. So effectively what one would say is probably as good a person as we can wish for in terms of a president, if he was able to get his way. The problem, of course, for him is that he's not necessarily able to get his way. And part of part of his problem, of course, is he has appointed as the Minister of Cooperative Development Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, who is also a very strong personality and has now shown some very authoritarian tendencies. So his opposition when he became president of the ANC was Dlamini Zuma. He seems to have co-opted her into government, but when she actually got the keys to the kingdom and was in charge to a large extent for a while, she really displayed some excessive authoritarian tendencies, which has made her very unpopular with the, let's just say, the white portion of the population. The feedback that I'm getting from my black friends is that some of them are also taking this view that she's way too authoritarian, but there are some people that think that she has the interests of the country at heart. So, but it does look like she has lost a lot of support through her authoritarian tendencies. The one thing that we have to say is that it's most likely that the cigarette ban is something that she personally, as a medical doctor, actually pushed forward, and it's a very silly arrangement. As the Americans learned with prohibition, if you prohibit these things, the only thing you do eventually is to play into the hands of the criminals who smuggle these things. So actually a great boost for organized crime in South Africa rather than for health. But it does look like the pendulum has swung away from Dlamini Zuma, and in the second half of the lockdown, rather than having decisions announced as decisions of the Command Council, the very idea of a Command Council sounds way too authoritarian to me in the first place, but rather than framing things as decisions of the Coronavirus Command Council, these things are now being framed as cabinet decisions, which is what they should be. And it does look like the pendulum has swung away from Dlamini Zuma back to Ramaphosa in the first place. But then the second thing that we have to look at is to say that in South Africa, actually, the normal thing that you rule when you're in government is not quite true. You rule through the ANC. So if we look at how Cyril came to power, the great influence at the last ANC conference in 2017 was the so-called Premier League. So there you see the three premiers, Free State, and Mpumalanga, and Northwest. Two of them have made it to high office. The third has been sidelined for basically corrupt activities. Interestingly enough, Supremo Homapela from Northwest was sidelined mainly by insiders in the ANC who objected to corrupt activities that he was involved in, whereas the other two are also accused of some fairly serious corrupt activities, but in spite of that, they've made it into high office. And what we've got to actually remember is that the reason that Cyril is in power today is because at the last moment, Didi Mabuza gave his supporters the instruction to vote for Cyril at the conference. If it hadn't been for that, in fact, Cyril wouldn't be in power today. So Cyril owes his position in a large measure to Didi Mabuza, and that is why he was forced to appoint Mabuza as the deputy president. So there's every reason to believe that Cyril didn't want to appoint Didi Mabuza as his deputy president, but he was actually forced into it. Neil, can I ask you to just put your camera off to save bandwidth? Thank you very much. So the low profile that Didi Mabuza has kept since shouldn't really distract from the fact that he's a very significant influence. And the way that Didi Mabuza came to influence is he apparently was quite corrupt, but he used the money from that corruption to actually recruit many more ANC members in Mpumalanga, which meant that as far as membership went, Mpumalanga had an outsized vote at the conference because you vote according to your number of members, not according to the size of your province. So Mpumalanga ANC became extremely powerful, and so building a power base in a province turned out to be a very good way to power for Didi Mabuza. Now, if I was a journalist, I would really have a good look at why Didi Mabuza is mostly absent and actually makes regular visits to Russia to be treated for some mysterious illness. There must be a story there. But journalists are being kept busy by more interesting local stuff than that. But a part of what happens is that we now sit with the top 6 in the ANC. So there you can see the top 6. And the top 6 in the ANC are split half and half. So 3 Cyril people and 3, shall we say, Ace people, if we like. So Ace Magashule, he seems to be the point person for the anti-Cyril faction. And there's been some prominent statements from him. So effectively, anything that is referred to the top 6, nothing controversial can be decided at this level because of the fact that we've got a 3-3 split. Now, interestingly enough, there's every reason to think that Ace's election wasn't 100% correct, but Cyril declined to appeal against Ace's election, and therefore he's now sitting with this deadlocked top 6 position. And in the absence of the top 6, we actually go to the NEC. So for all practical purposes, the government in South Africa, for the moment, is run through the NEC, the National Executive Council, 40 people elected at the conference, and if they meet on a regular basis, and if you don't have a majority at the NEC, you don't govern. So effectively, the NEC is the government of the party, and it's an incredibly powerful institution. So both our previous presidents were eventually recalled by the NEC. And when the NEC recalled them, they didn't actually say or ha, they just went. So effectively, if the NEC deselects you, you are deselected on a permanent basis. So that's where the real power lies. And the feedback we have, just to reiterate from previous cycles, the feedback we have is we've got a pro-Cyril faction, and we'll look at some of those in a moment. Then we've got the anti-Cyril section led by Ace Magashule. Let's just call it the Ace Magashule section. And then we've got the Communist Party and COSATU. And again, we'll look at the vested interest in a second. So one of the things that I thought that we should look at is, so who are the people actually supporting Cyril? So if we were to say that Cyril was to die in a helicopter accident tomorrow, who might succeed? The deputy presidential candidate on Cyril's slate was Sisulu. So there you can see her. The hair is always a bit wild, but there's every reason to think that she's not corrupt, and she has serious ambition of becoming the next president. Obviously, Walter Sisulu's daughter, so the Sisulu clan, a very strong influence in the ANC over time. Then the next person that we have to look at is to say the person appointed as the Minister of Finance. So traditionally, actually, the Minister of Finance is the second most powerful person in any government. And there we see Tito Mboweni. Now, the problem with Tito Mboweni is that Tito serves because Cyril asked him to. Tito is really, everything we see says that Tito is not motivated by the fact that he is the Minister of Finance. It's something that he does because he thinks that he has to do it, but he's not really all that dedicated to it. And basically, he reached the peak of his ambition when he was the president of the Reserve Bank, or the governor of the Reserve Bank. And actually, what happened over the last week is when the central bank governor in Zambia was fired, Tito basically very undiplomatically came to the fore and supported his fellow central banker. So central banking seems to be an important issue in Tito's life. But for the moment, Tito is the Minister of Finance, and actually what we hear from our sources is that Tito is actually against any raising of taxes in order to pay for the whole lockdown adventure. So Tito's view of the world, and it's very difficult to differ from him, is that taxes in South Africa are as high as they can be without actually hindering long-term economic growth. So Tito's view of the world is that we need to make our finances work, even in the absence of serious tax rises. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that you can only do that if you bring expenses under control, and we'll get back to the vested interests in that way in a second. The other person that I think that is often overlooked, and that South Africa really owes a great debt to, is Pravin Gordhan. So the real person who stood up against state capture and put his career on the line in order to oppose state capture is Pravin Gordhan. So Pravin Gordhan also very much a key part of the Cyril team and a key part of the cleanup exercise in the state-owned enterprises. Now, the other part of Cyril's coalition is the SACP and COSATU. Now, we will all recognize Blade Nzimande as a well-known player in the South African affairs, but Zingiswa Losi is far less well-known, but she is actually the Secretary General of COSATU. So some very important people in the sense that they are the balance in the NEC. So in the NEC, there's a deadlock between the Zuma-aligned faction, if you can still say Zuma-aligned, let's say ACE-aligned faction, the Cyril-aligned faction. Neither of them has a majority. So the swing vote sits with the Communist Party and COSATU, and they will support Cyril because they also don't like corruption, because they don't benefit from it. But at the same time, they will actually promote their own vested interests. So you cannot act against the high wages or the overemployment in the civil service because of the fact that these are the constituents of COSATU and the SACP. So as long as you don't offend them, they will support you in the NEC. So that's the balancing act that Cyril has to deal with. Now, having had a quick look at the actors within the ANC, which I think is really important for the moment, maybe we should have a quick look at the actors outside the ANC. So what you will see if you look at it is that the South African Constitution was actually designed to be a constitution that promotes coalition government. So if you look at European governments where you have proportionate representation, they virtually always govern in coalition. So in South Africa, we've had the exceptional circumstance that we've had, even though you have proportionate representation, you've had a clear majority for one party for more than 20 years. But that's actually not the natural state of affairs in proportional government, proportional representation. You typically govern with a coalition. And here we see the two main movers in the DA. And the exact problem in the DA is that these are the two main movers, especially the one in the background. So effectively, the DA has tried from time to time to widen their support into the black community, but whenever someone from the black portion of the DA has come to too much prominence, Helen Zille seems to have sidelined them. So for all practical purposes, the DA has not covered itself in glory, and the fantastic opportunity offered by the weakness and the disunity in the ANC has not been utilized by the DA to promote themselves. So we actually have some ex-DA people on the black side who would be interesting partners in government for a, let's say, moderate government of the ANC. So if we see the two latest people, Vusi Maimane was the leader in the last election, not covering himself in glory, and then of course Herman Mashaba, a converted businessman into politician. So the two of them may have taken things forward, but they seem to have run afoul of Helen Zille, and therefore they're not being promoted. In the same way that we now have a commentator in the press who is also a previous prominent black person in the DA. So the Masabuko. So effectively, it seems like the DA is back to consolidating its base among the white population rather than to actually broaden its support in the black community. So effectively, what we're seeing is that if we look at the situation we're facing, the first thing we have to say is that there has been a great airing of corruption. And what you would normally do if you are in government and you want to actually deal with corruption, what you would do is you would bring it to the surface, because actually unknown corruption, if the population doesn't really know about the level of corruption, that is less of a political burden than known corruption. So right now, more people would say that corruption is a problem than said that would have said that 5 years ago. But 5 years ago, corruption was a lot worse than it is today, but it was under the radar. So when you bring it above the radar, you have to act on it quickly. The problem that we're facing now is that corruption is being exposed, but not acted on quickly. Maybe just as an oversight, I neglected to quickly talk about COPE. So let's just have a quick look at COPE, because effectively, if you think about moderate black voters, if they were disillusioned with the ANC, who would they vote for? And you would have thought COPE would be a very good alternative, but there you see the two main characters who started COPE. And the problem for them, of course, is that they couldn't actually decide which of them was the boss, and therefore COPE went nowhere. So COPE really never became an alternative. The other alternative appearing, but on the other side of the political spectrum, of course, is Julius Malema. Now, Julius Malema, again, what happened in the EFF is there's never been any doubt about who's in charge of the EFF, but there's also, we see other people in the EFF making some progress and then being sidelined by Malema. So Malema's authoritarian tendencies inside the EFF also limits the overall effectiveness of the party. But again, the EFF may be an effective coalition partner for the ANC if we were ever to get to coalition politics. So let's just go back and examine where the vested interests lie. So if you look at Cyril's situation, once he inherited power through being very patient, he faced a situation where there are basically 4 types of vested interests that he had to deal with before he could deal with the aspirations that he and many South Africans have for the country. So the first part of the vested interest is that there's a very strong vested interest in the state capture and corrupt faction of the ANC, mainly represented now by Ace Magashule and Didi Mabuza. These are the people who are misusing their political situation in order to score tenders. So it's interesting that you don't actually win a tender, you score a tender. That's the language that's being used. So effectively, tenders are a way to distribute money to politically powerful people and their families. And this is something that they are not easily going to be abused of, if you like. They're not going to be removed from this position very easily. And by the way, this seems to be extremely widespread, and there's quite a deep level of entrenchment of the tenderpreneurs, if you like. So a very strong vested interest in terms of saying we are in this position and we like this position, we're not going to give it up. By the way, the dealers in exotic cars around the Joburg area are telling us that they are seeing significantly less trade in the last year or so as corruption has come under pressure and you start getting things like lifestyle audits, etc. But nevertheless, Ace Magashule's son bought a 2 million rand BMW within days of scoring a COVID-19 tender. So that's the one very strong vested interest. And it's a clearly destructive vested interest and something that clearly should be fought against. And it's actually easy to demonstrate why you want to remove these people. But these people are in a lot of powerful positions and they will support each other. And it's clear that they haven't given up. They are not of the opinion that they are about to be sidelined, and therefore they are not actually coming forward and supporting Cyril and saying, sorry, we won't be corrupt anymore. They are continuing their corrupt activities. And someone like Ace Magashule actually comes out and says, all ANC cadres do business with government. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, again, if you think about it as a statement to the general public, that makes no sense at all. Effectively, it says we are all corrupt. But within the ANC, which is the debate that Ace wants to take forward, he says, why blame me and my family? All of you are equally guilty. So effectively, within the NEC, the conversation is, don't blame me, you are doing the same thing. So it's extremely widespread, and that obviously represents a significant problem. There are some people who take serious offense at that. So Jackson Mthembu, for instance, the minister in the presidency, he has come out to the press and said, I've been in the ANC in important positions for a long time, and I've never done business with the state. So there are some people who are offended by that, but there's also a lot of people who are caught in that net, and therefore they are very reluctant to take that forward. But the one thing that we have to say about that is that there is great public disillusionment with the corruption that has clearly become so evident with all the COVID tenders. And so this is something that really is new, in the sense that there seems to be a greater level of exasperation and outrage among the general public about the COVID tenders that has been scored by ANC cadres. And that has given the honest faction a chance to oppose those vested interests. And there's a great deal, even among the black population, there's this whole thing of saying, so the ANC is now going to investigate the ANC and take action against the ANC for ANC corruption. But what we're actually seeing is it is the power struggle within the ANC between the corrupt faction and the non-corrupt faction. So that's the one vested interest. The second vested interest is the vested interest of comfortable civil servants and employees of state-owned enterprises. So in essence, since roughly 2004, there's been a great expansion in the employment by the government and also by the state-owned enterprises. So places like SAA and Eskom has greatly expanded the number of employees, and also the wages and salaries in the civil service has gone up significantly relatively to the private sector. So there's a strong base of comfortable civil servants who do not want to be dislodged from that comfort. So these are not necessarily corrupt people. These are just people who have a job that they may or may not be competent at. Because remember, the attitude since the Mbeki era is that anyone can do the job as long as they have the right political credentials. So a lot of these people have some kind of political or they are the right gender or race or whatever. They get appointed. They don't actually get appointed according to competency. And therefore they are sitting in comfortable positions, getting paid, and they don't want that situation to change. So who are they represented in this whole game? Mainly COSATU and the SACP, but it's actually a more general ANC issue. So the way in which to fix the government finances, if you take the Mboweni and you say that we are already getting as much tax as we are likely to get from the population, then we have the situation where you have to actually lower the wages and reduce the number of staff in the civil service. And there's every reason to think that the civil service could do its job quite competently with significantly fewer people, and that civil service salaries are significantly too high. But that then is another big vested interest. And if you hear the announcements from the state-owned enterprises about restructuring and about reducing staff, etc., you would then see Pravin Gordhan come out a day or two later saying, no, they were wrong. There will be no reduction in staff. And even at SAA, which now eventually seems to be having to reduce itself to a much smaller size, for a long time we saw the demand from the government to not reduce staff at SA, and that is at the behest of COSATU. It's pandering to that specific vested interest. And if you are sitting in Cyril's chair, clearly Cyril has decided that he needs to take care of he needs to sort out the corrupt faction first, and therefore he will not offend the second vested interest, which is the overstaffed civil service. Now that's the second vested interest. Then there's a third vested interest, And that third vested interest are the actual politicians. So the politicians like to stay in power. So that's their vested interest. They, in the old days, they talked about sitting comfortably on the green benches. So the politicians who are in power are enjoying that power and enjoying those positions. So they want to stay in power. And actually, that brings to mind something else, and that is they have to get re-elected from time to time. And the main reason then that Didi Mabuza eventually decided to back Cyril Ramaphosa as the next president of the ANC is because Cyril was a much better candidate in terms of election than Dlamini Zuma. So there's every reason to think that if Dlamini Zuma had been the ANC candidate in the last election, the ANC would have had less than 50% of the votes and would therefore have been forced into coalition. And I guess the same is more true today than it was then. If the ANC was to go into the next election with Dlamini Zuma as their candidate, they would virtually certainly not get 50% of the vote. In fact, there are reasons to believe that even with Cyril as their candidate, and Cyril is a very good political candidate, there's a great disillusionment among ordinary people with what Cyril has achieved in his 2.5 years. So those who had hoped for a cleanup in the administration and clean administration going forward are very disillusioned. So even with Cyril, they may not actually get more than 50% of the vote at the next election. So the question is, what do you do in order to just stay in power? So effectively, even for the state capture faction, which is under some pressure from the Ramaphosa side of things, there is the question of how do we make sure that the ANC stays in power? And all the polls we see is that in spite of the disillusionment with Cyril, Cyril is by far the most popular candidate of the ANC still. And therefore, it's likely that the rest of the ANC will keep supporting him as the person who will take them through the next election, because it gives them the best chance of actually having a majority in the next election. And then the last vested interest, the fourth one, is the fact that actually Cyril himself would like to be the president for the rest of the next 7.5 years, and therefore there's another vested interest, the urge to stay in power. So for those of you who think that the urge to stay in power is not a very strong urge among people who experience power, go and read Lord of the Rings. It's a cautionary tale, and I think it's actually very true. Once you are in power, there's a very strong urge to keep that power. Now, where does that leave us? What has happened recently? The thing that has happened is that, first of all, you've got to say that Cyril, since coming to power, has really not done nothing, but he has done very little inside the ANC, where he has to compromise with his NEC colleagues on a regular basis. But within the government, he has actually had a much stronger situation. He's been able to appoint people, and he's appointed a lot of quite influential people eventually in order to make sure that the corruption gets prosecuted. So the whole office of the prosecutor, the new broom at SARS, the new broom at ESCOM, etc., etc. So JP Landman has made written a long article about how much Cyril has actually achieved in the state, but not inside the ANC. So in the state, Cyril has actually already effected very significant change, but the consequences of that change has not really filtered through yet, because it takes a long time to build cases against corrupt people, and there's a very strong desire from the new NPA not to go halfway, but to make sure they build the cases properly against corrupt people and that they prosecute them. Now, again, if you look at it, there seems to be a strong possible case against Ace Magashule himself. There seems to be a strong possible case against Didi Mabuza. And so it will be interesting to see whether those prosecutions eventually change the balance of power. But it seems like at this point, the absolute outrage of the public at the corruption with COVID tenders and the exposing of the depth of the corruption of the ANC has actually brought about a renewed action from Cyril. So in his letter to the ANC last week, he actually says that in corruption in South Africa, the ANC is accused number one. So effectively, what this means is that Cyril has declared war within the ANC against corruption. So this whole question of the ANC will now look at the ANC in corruption, that's not the final word from a legal perspective. That is an attempt by Cyril to actually clean up the ANC. So there's been some fairly strong clashes very recently between Ace Magashule personally and Cyril. And we've had some reports of some fairly serious shouting matches between the two of them at the NEC. And the reason for this is it looks like Cyril may have now grabbed the initiative to sideline the corrupt faction from power. So the main thing that we see is that it's absolutely clear that those people who say that Cyril is just actually a front person for a corrupt organization is absolutely not correct. Cyril is fighting hard in the background to sideline the corrupt faction. He has for the moment done nothing, and I don't think that he seriously intends to, in the short term, do anything about the second vested interest, the overpaid civil servants. However, this brings me to the future for the South African economy. So maybe just to conclude on the politics, there is no hard and fast conclusion yet, but it looks like the battle between the corrupt faction and the anti-corruption faction is coming to a head in the ANC, and we may see that actually resolve itself within the next couple of months. But there does seem to have been a swing towards the anti-corruption. So the overreach of the corrupt faction during the COVID epidemic has really negatively affected them. And also the overreach of the authoritarian faction during the COVID epidemic seems to have been to have affected them negatively in the struggle for power within the ANC. So it may be that Cyril actually comes out. So a month or two ago, it looked like Cyril was being dominated within the ANC. Right now, it looks like he's actually experiencing a resurgence, and that is bringing that battle to a head and not waiting for the legal processes to sort that out for him. Or those legal processes are also happening in the background. And some positive results have come from those legal processes. So if you think about the VBS arrests, at least some people are now being arrested for these corrupt activities. And we're likely to see a lot more of that. Now, I've spent my hour effectively on the politics, so I've not really said all that much about the future from an economic and an investment point of view. So I'll be fairly brief on that. What's very interesting is that two very interested organizations have brought out plans for the resurrection, if we can call that, of the South African economy after the lockdown. And that is Business South Africa, which obviously represents the serious business interests, and the other is the ANC. So the ANC's plan for the economy is that we should center the plan to revitalize the South African economy on infrastructure spending. So why infrastructure spending? First of all, obviously, what happens in the aftermath of the lockdown is that there's not enough demand in the South African economy, and therefore, one of the big things that we need to do is to increase demand. So the government should be spending money, but the government already owes too much. And therefore, infrastructure spending is a way to build your balance sheet while putting stimulation into the economy. So this is basically the same plan that every government around the world has to revitalize their own economies after the COVID-19 downturn. So in South Africa, the ANC's plan and Business South Africa's plan are both to say we should have a serious infrastructure build program, and that will actually stimulate the economy to the extent that we can get our economy going again. So although they're saying the same thing, and both of them, interestingly enough, are saying that this should mostly be done in terms of public-private partnerships. So they're both saying virtually identical things about taking the economy forward. And the interesting thing is that we've gotten rid of the idea that the government should do it. So even the ANC is not saying the government should do it, just because the government in South Africa has been so incompetent for such a long time. But the ANC is still saying that the government should play a leading role in giving direction to this program. So the developmental state promoted by Mbeki is very much alive in ANC thinking, whereas in the Business South Africa suggestions, there's far less of the government should lead, and much more saying it's very important to involve the private sector in these things. Now, one of the interesting thoughts is that even Pravin Gordhan, when he wants to resurrect SAA, says, I want a private sector interest in this. And the main reason why they want that is once you get the private sector involved, it's much less vulnerable to state capture. So effectively, anything owned 100% by the state, like Eskom, is vulnerable to state capture. But Telkom, under the old regime, had private sector interest, and therefore they were never as vulnerable to state capture. So Telkom turned out to be a much better model, still owned to a large extent by the state, but also with a private sector interest. So effectively, involving the private sector is a very important part of taking that forward. But now it brings me to where I actually want to conclude my talk for today, and that is that to a very large extent, the whole question of state capture has meant that those institutions of the government that was not captured has to some extent been overreacting to the state capture threat. So in effect, if you look at the economic situation and you talk to private sector economists, they will all tell you that they think the Reserve Bank could do more to stimulate the economy. And they all say that the government reacted too slowly and that the government could do more to support the economy. So why is the Reserve Bank not doing more, and why is the Treasury so reluctant to embark on major stimulatory measures? And the main reason for that is both of them are so sensitive to the pressures from state capturers, because someone like Esmagashule comes out openly and says that we should do quantity easing from the Reserve Bank's point of view. So the Reserve Bank, when they look at the government bond market and they think they might intervene in that market, they say, but that might be seen as quantitative easing, and we don't want to be seen to do that because we don't like the pressure to do that. So actually, what is happening is there's an over-conservative reaction, both from Treasury and the Reserve Bank, in terms of the policies that they are following. So what we are seeing is that it may be that the South African economy will come out of the current recession very slowly, just because actually the amount of stimulus being added into the South African economy from the government and from the Reserve Bank are inadequate. So apart from any question of business confidence, because remember now, we have to, in order to get the economy growing again, we actually need business confidence, because that's what drives investment into the economy. So investment is at a very low level because of the lockdown, but in order to get investment going again, you need to get confidence in business. And that confidence has two sides. The one is that the economy will be strong, and the other is that corruption will be under control. Now, neither of those two are present in South Africa at the moment, and it looks like there's still some doubt about the extent to which corruption will be brought under control, on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's also a great reluctance to be extremely stimulatory, both from Treasury and from the Reserve Bank. So what we actually are foreseeing is that the upswing in South Africa will be a long, hard slog. And so the political fights in South Africa are likely to play out against the background of some fairly weak economic growth. And then obviously the last little conclusion for me in terms of where do we go in terms of investments is it's unlikely that the South African corporate sector as a whole will become extremely profitable in the short to medium term, just because the growth in the economy is unlikely to be supportive of that. So all of this basically leads me to say, in principle, I think that it is prudent for South Africans to invest the bulk of what they have in terms of wealth preservation offshore, but they should not ignore the opportunities inside South Africa, because we do believe that from a wealth creation point of view, from a business point of view, there will be plenty of opportunities to make money in South Africa for entrepreneurs over the next 10 years. But it will be limited to certain pockets. It doesn't look like there will be a rising tide that lifts all boats. Thank you very much for listening, comments, and questions.
I think, Wikus, all of that, we've had a lot of questions just recently about the Rand and whether it's an opportune time now, because more and more people are saying or agreeing with you that it's not, things are not going to get better from a corruption point of view. How will that affect business? And business has surprisingly held up reasonably well, but on the other hand, you know, how will that affect the Rand when people want to move their money offshore?
So I guess, Lee, thank you very much. The first thing to say from the point of view of the Rand is that in the medium term, in the really long term, the main determinant of the value of the Rand is how many Rands you create. And there we still have an independent central bank who are keeping the amount of Rands that is being created under fairly strict control. So that means that the idea that the Rand will run away and be extremely weak and become virtually worthless, there's no reason to think that will be the case. So in fact, there's every reason to think that the Rand for the moment will stay within its historical patterns. And its historical pattern says that the average value of the Rand needs to be at around 1350. So we are still at an extremely weak level of the rand. And the second thing that we have to say about that is mostly driven, the weakness of the rand currently is mostly driven by global factors. So the rand is weak, but so are a lot of other emerging market currencies. So the rand is always a little bit of an exaggeration on those. So what we would say is, in the short run, we think that the rand will come back to a more reasonable level. But we think that the levels of stronger than 12 Rand 50, when Cyril became the president, the Rand briefly went to 11 Rand 20. So we think that it's a long time before we see that again. It's possible in a year or two's time, if everybody around the world starts buying commodities to run the infrastructure projects, the Rand will become stronger again than people believe it can. But for the moment, we think that buying a serious amount of dollars at weaker than let's say 16 to the dollar is not a good idea. So we think that the rand will, within a reasonable time, become stronger than 16. But we think that the rand will probably stick between 15 and 16 for a fairly long period of time. So starting to nibble offshore would be not a bad plan. For our own clients, we've got a much more, let's say, scientific statistics-based schedule where we buy the dollars, start our offshore investment, and we then hedge back to rands if we think the rand is too weak at the point where the offshore investment is made, and then we gradually unhedge as the rand strengthens. So, but effectively, I would say that at any point where the rand is weaker than 16, you should be somewhat patient.
Great, thanks. You caused somebody to sneeze there anyway.
Yeah, no, I think the currency is always a controversial thing, but what I would say about the currency is the main feature of the rand is not that it's a weak currency, even though people tend to think so. The main feature of the rand is that it's an extremely volatile currency. Now, volatility means it will go weaker than you think when it becomes weak, and then it will go stronger than you think when it becomes strong. So my own experience of the rand is that it will surprise you in terms of how far it will go in either direction.
Lee, it's Keith here. I just want to go back to the politics, because thank you very much for a really fantastic overview. There's one thing missing from your analysis, and you're not alone. It's something that's never spoken about in South African politics, and that's tribal affiliation. In any other country, polls would be conducted and you would get a breakdown of, let's say, tribal affiliation, favoritism for this candidate, that candidate, the next thing. Now, without going into too much detail, I was taught South African politics by two newspaper legends, Percy Corboza and Jim Bailey, who used to sit and argue about the importance of tribal affiliation in the South African sense. Now, Percy, who died a few years before the legitimation of the politics, he told us that there is no way that a Zulu, under a one-man, one-vote dispensation, that a Zulu would ever be president of South Africa. Because he said the rest of the tribes, as we would call it, wouldn't permit it. Well, he was wrong. But the original power base was clearly with the Xhosa-speaking people. Mandela, Mbeki, Tambo, the Sisulus, etc. They had a real hold on power, and they lost that with Mbeki's growing unpopularity. And we then had a Zulu fiefdom under Zuma. What we've never had is a coalition of northern and central tribal affiliations. And I think you have to see S. Magashule in that context. Yes, he's corrupt. Yes, he says we're all corrupt. But he also has a very powerful ethnic power base, potentially, because he's the only one who can unify the southern Sotho, the northern Sotho, in the middle. Now, Cyril, most people, if you say to most people, what is Cyril? They look at you, what do you mean? Cyril's a Venda. The Venda are one of the tiniest tribal groups in South Africa. But tribalism is still a factor. Let's not overstate it. But it's never spoken about because it's considered to be politically divisive. You don't want to emphasize that this person's a Zulu, that one's a Venda, that one's a Shangaan, etc. Because that, of course, is what led to the incapacity of Black South Africa to confront the apartheid regime. It was so divided, and so it became necessary to suppress discussion about tribalism. We were all supposed to transcend that, but I don't think it has been transcended, and I think that we've got to see Magashule as a potential unifier of let's call it tribal affiliations and sentiments, because we're not going to have another Xhosa regime. Their political power really has almost disintegrated. We're not going to have another Zulu one because of the excesses of the Zuma one. So what's going to come into the middle? Will Cyril be able to hold on to power of this almost non-existent tribal base of the Venda? There are less than 1 million Venda-speaking people in the country. It's not a power base. Magashule has got a very, very big potential ethnic power base. I just think it's something that's not really often spoken about in South Africa because it's considered to be politically divisive and incorrect. And black people correctly don't like the emphasis to be put on tribal affiliation. They prefer to take a different view, but it's still there.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that tribal affiliation has been a very strong influence. And maybe you're absolutely right. What we should do is we should explicitly recognize that rather than to just talk it under. So in a certain sense, if you think about it, there was at the time that Mbeki was elected above Ramaphosa, it was done with the explicit view of Walter Sisulu, actually, that the next person should be a Xhosa. So Cyril was sidelined in part because he had played the politics incorrectly in terms of Winnie and Peter Mokaba primarily, but also because the senior people in the ANC wanted to have another Xhosa. Now, a portion of what I've heard in the grapevine, and I'm not enough of an expert to say this with absolute authority, is that there was actually traditionally a thing that said that the ANC leadership should actually rotate between Zulu and Xhosa. So that part of the whole Zuma thing was it is the turn of a Zulu, and therefore the Zuma candidacy. But then again, when Zuma went, Dlamini Zuma as the next Zulu was suggested. The other very interesting thing, of course, is that the ANC stayed at just above 60% in the vote after the transfer from Mbeki to Zuma. But what happened to a very large extent is they gained the Zulu vote with Zuma. So the Zulu vote, which had gone to Inkatha before, came to the ANC with the Zuma promotion, and they lost the coloured vote. So with the sidelining of Trevor Manuel, which obviously is a prominent coloured person, there's another vote that can be an ANC vote from time to time, but it has become actually a strong DA vote. So I think that the whole question of tribal affiliation is still very much alive, and even in white politics, the alignment between Afrikaans speakers and English speakers is quite an important issue still. So part of the rightward swing in the DA was because the Freedom Front was starting to eat into their power base on the other side. So I think that kind of it's absolutely correct that tribal affiliation is important. And then if you think about the Premier League, they are if you were to say the non-Zulu, non-Xhosa power base pretty much represented the Tswana and Sotho peoples represented in the Premier League. So I think it is something that we should take into account. I think you're absolutely right.
No, definitely. And I mean, within the old ANC, Albert Luthuli was the Zulu leader. But after him, there was a dearth of leadership, largely because of the power of Buthelezi and Inkatha, that the ANC was not a dominant force. And I think there's a lot of evidence that Mandela himself wanted to be succeeded somewhere by a Zulu leader. He felt that was very important. But once Mbeki got rid of Zuma in Parliament and dismissed him, that didn't unfold as it was supposed to. So, yeah.
But partly, in my view, I think that one of Cyril's advantages is the fact that he doesn't represent one of the strong power bases. So effectively, he doesn't represent a threat to any of the strong power bases. He doesn't represent a threat to the long-run Zulu descendancy. He doesn't represent a threat to anyone else. So sometimes what you get is when you get multiple strong forces. If your Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, for instance, he was actually a Malawian of origin. So the fact that he wasn't of one of the strong tribes in Zambia actually gave him a kind of independent status, if you like. So I think Cyril, to some extent, plays that independent role where social factors start actually dominating. So effectively, if you think about it, there's also a very strong split between urban and rural starting to emerge. So the urban people would mostly support Cyril, whereas the rural people would support the Premier League type of idea. So there's also an urban-rural split that you should take into account.
Very much so. Thank you.